Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooton Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
All right, we're back and excited to bring you more information that will keep you and your loved ones safe while you're out on the internet or scrolling through your favorite social media sites. This is Don Hooton Jr., and today I'll be your host. In a fast-paced, ever-changing world, we rely on the internet and social media to gather our information to keep in touch with friends and family. According to Statista, in 2017, the most recent year for which full data is available, people spent 135 minutes per day, or nearly 2.5 hours on social media. That's up from 2016 when people averaged 126 minutes per day. According to Forbes, the average adult consumes 5 times more information every day than their counterpart 50 years ago. Much of that has to do with the internet and new technology, but they also state that we spend as much as 12 hours a day in front of the TV and computer. Could we or our loved ones be in danger while we're sitting in the comfort of our own homes online? This episode is going to give you an inside look into the world of internet security and safety. Our guest will be Tom Galvin, Executive Director for the Digital Citizens Alliance, a consumer-focused group whose mission is to raise awareness among the public and policymakers about how to make the internet safer. Tom is a strategic communications and government relations executive with over 20 years of corporate enterprise, cybersecurity, and public affairs experience. Tom has engaged with criminals online to uncover those who are stealing credit card information and even selling illegal drugs to expose the dark world of the internet. He does this so that people like us listening to this podcast can be more aware of the things we and our loved ones can fall into while online, even if it's in the safety of our own homes. Thank you for listening to the All Me podcast. Please be sure to hit subscribe so that you won't miss an episode. We'd also like to ask that you be sure to please give us a positive review so that more people can hear the great information we have to offer. Let's get to the interview. Today, we're going to be speaking with Tom Galvin, who has spent most of his life working in public relations and internet security. The internet and social media can be a great place to read the news, find out information about any topic under the sun, and keeping up with our friends and loved ones. But it can be a very dark place, and we're lucky to have someone like Tom Galvin on the podcast to help share his knowledge and make the internet a safer place. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really look forward to it.
Good, man. Well, you've got a really outstanding background that I think a lot of listeners are going to be very interested in, and you've been in the internet security field for over a decade. To give the guests an idea of the work that you do, please tell us more about your career and how you got into internet security.
It's a great question. I've had a few different careers along the way. Started in journalism, then went into technology. And when I was in technology at VeriSign, I got very interested in how do we make sure this thing that was emerging in the early 2000s was safe, particularly for kids. And I became a sponsor of a program where we were helping organizations make sure chat rooms at the time that 13 and 14-year-old kids would go on to talk to other 13, 14-year-old kids, that they weren't being infiltrated by pedophiles and those who would want to do harm. So I became interested and active in internet security from a child safety standpoint about 20 years ago, working at VeriSign. VeriSign is in the internet security space. It's responsible for making sure websites are authenticated and the domain industry. So it was a real leader in making sure the internet could stay both secure from attacks, but also could be safe for people to use it. And really got involved in that point of making sure that we built the best internet we could.
Interesting. I remember those days being in the old AOL chat rooms and talking with people. And I even remember one called IRC, and you basically had your little handle and you could talk with virtually anyone. Just trying to think as a user back as a kid during those days when I'm chatting with people, what sort of safety measures were you able to put in place, and what sort of things were you finding in these chat rooms? That you had mentioned pedophiles and what have you, but give us a little bit more detail about that.
Sure. It's at the earliest days of the internet, it may feel like the Wild West now, but it truly is nothing compared to what it was back then. So there was very little authentication. There was very little figuring out who people were. it was a miraculous thing for people in New Jersey or Idaho to be able to speak to someone in Berlin or Moscow or Caracas. You know, it was amazing a way for people to get to know other people. And that was a great thing. But like everything, a criminal element or divisive element will try to come in and exploit those openings. And that was what was happening. You had largely men going into chat rooms and impersonating young girls in hopes of being able to groom them and get to know them. And we've all known and seen stories about how that works and what happens then. And our job, working with a great company called iSafe, was to see whether or not we could authenticate users, which meant you had to prove your age, so that if you were 13, people know you were 13, and if you were 42, people knew you were 42. And it became a way of being able to help young people understand who they were talking to. And there was a lot of progress made, but frankly, technology kind of overtook it. And you don't see those chat rooms anymore. Facebook came along, of course, and people found different ways to connect with both friends and people they may want to know from other places. So it changed over time. But as technology changes, the issues remain the same. How do we make sure that people can be safe online, that they can engage in commerce online, that they're not scammed, and we don't have folks trying to take advantage of the unwitting?
That's so important, and just very appreciative of the work that you're doing. Let's go back. I went through your biography and just trying to figure out, your past and how you got to where you are today. And in 2005, you started a company, 463 Communications. Why did you start that company? What sort of products and services did you offer?
Sure. 463, which is named after a baseball double play. So we're all baseball fans, but it also meant something to the services we were offering. Really came about because of my previous two, I'd say, careers. I had started as a political journalist and did that for 12 years, finishing up with the New York Daily News, covering Washington and the White House and campaigns and Congress. And in that saw a lot of policy and political things. And then went and worked for two large technology companies, Cisco, helping open an office for them in DC, and then running communications for them out in San Jose, before going on to VeriSign, where I had several jobs. And between those two things, we saw really at that time an intersection of technology, which was just emerging, and suddenly there was a lot of issues to confront that we had never thought about, and policy. How do you make sure that we have policies in place? So 463 was a double play, meant technology and policy, California and DC, and trying to bridge the gap between Silicon Valley and Washington in really a different era. And we were the first company that was a pure play. We were designed specifically to think through and help DC and Silicon Valley think through the technology policy issues that were out there. Interesting. So when does that bring Digital Citizens Alliance into the picture? Because it looks like, you have 463 Communications, you're doing, you're bridging the gap between tech and policy with Silicon Valley and DC. At what point do you say, let's form this organization, Digital Citizens Alliance? Why do you form it? And what's the whole genesis behind formation of this organization? Great question. We have seen several eras of technology since the internet came about. The first one was primarily commerce and hardware. The big companies at the time were companies like Cisco and IBM. And then this second wave came around, which was social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we're in that now. And with each of those different eras of technology, we saw new issues arise. Mm-hmm. And as we started to see technology become obviously more pervasive and do a lot of great things, there's a lot of great things about technology, but we also started to see new potential harms and threats to consumers. And when we looked at that, we realized that, we don't really have anyone who's out there trying to make sure that we understand the consumer risks that are out there, both helping consumers understand those risks, but then from a consumer perspective, helping policymakers understand how to get ahead of these things, how to anticipate and understand them. So just like 463 tried to be a bridge between Silicon Valley and DC, Digital Citizens tried to become a bridge between digital, consumers and individuals using the internet and the policymakers who are trying to think through this new era that nobody had anticipated of social media and what we now call surveillance capitalism in a way, which is, there's an old adage now with social media which is if you don't pay for a product, you are the product. And what that means is when you go on to Google and get things for free, or Facebook and get things for free, or Twitter, and you don't pay any of that, they're scraping your data so they can monetize it and be able to, sell it to someone else. And on the other side of it is there's bad actors who are looking at how they can exploit those platforms to do everything from selling illicit and dangerous steroids to opioids to fake, stolen credit cards to counterfeits and a lot of other things, including some of the original work I was doing, looking at people trying to use the internet, whether it's pedophiles or sex trafficking. So we really wanted to be a bridge between those two worlds. And our belief is that we need to understand the impact of this technology to make good societal decisions about what we should do with it. And that's really where DCA came from. And I did it together with 463, and then we rebranded our company Verge Strategies and did both simultaneously.
Fascinating. And I think a lot of people don't realize the ease of access of some of these illicit substances that can be purchased on these various platforms. So what is Digital Citizens Alliance doing to make the general public aware that these issues exist, and what adult influencers and those who are out on these platforms should be aware of when just they're spending their free time looking at whatever information is they might be looking at?
No, it's a great question. And we really try to, there's an old journalist adage, which is don't tell me, show me. So you don't spend 7 paragraphs trying to explain something. Demonstrate it through a story of how it actually happens, or it happens to someone. So we try to do that. So we do a lot of investigations where we will purchase things online. We will engage with criminals or bad actors online. Oftentimes we'll either film it or tape it to really show our work. We will look at websites that have illicit services or goods. We'll make sure we take screenshots so we show all our work. And so what oftentimes we'll do, I'll give you one example. We were looking at the market for stolen credit cards, which can be a very large market, oftentimes on mainstream platforms such as Facebook or Google or Twitter or Instagram, YouTube. And we would go on and pose as a consumer trying to purchase them. And we would talk to those peddling stolen credit cards and ask what they have, and then make purchases, and then report that, and also oftentimes let law enforcement or public officials know about it so they can do with it what they will. So it's not uncommon for us to go, for lack of a better term, undercover. We've gone into actual what are called internet sweepstakes cafes, which are oftentimes illegal gambling halls in cities, with a hidden camera and demonstrated what the illicit activities are there. In the case of our report that we did on steroids, we engaged with those selling illegal anabolic steroids and human growth hormone, HGH, to demonstrate the ease of which you can purchase these and then go have them tested in a lab to demonstrate that they're not always even real, which raises another issues about public safety and the safety of those purchasing them. So our job, we believe, is to go out there in the field, engage with criminals and bad actors to show what happens when consumers do this and the potential risks that are involved.
I think that's so interesting. So have you ever taken part in engaging with these criminals or these individuals online? And if so, explain to us what that's like. And when I say what that's like, do they ask specific questions to try and vet that you are who you are and you're not just somebody doing an investigative report? Take us through what that might be like if you're online, whether it's talking with somebody about stolen credit cards or illegal gambling rings, or even purchasing items like anabolic steroids and human growth hormone.
Absolutely. More often than not, they do no vetting. They are used to operating online with very little problem. And so they are ready to operate that way. In an instance where we were looking at the sale of painkillers like opioids online, we had reached out online. I think it was on Google, on YouTube. We had reached out to someone offering prescription opioids, but without needing a prescription. And we engaged with them first online and then got their email. We engaged with them there. We posed as a 15-year-old boy. And then when it came time to say, we want to talk to you by phone, we called them. We had a 15-year-old young man actually engage with them on the phone, saying to the effect, I'm 15, I'm using my dad's credit card, I do not have a prescription, but I want prescription painkillers. And the person only said, what's the credit card number?
Wow.
And there was another quote from it that said, no prescription, no problem. And we filmed it all, and then we release it to the public through the media and doing presentations, for example, with state attorneys general or the DEA to demonstrate the ease of it so people could see it. So that's an example where we oftentimes will engage with a bad actor or a criminal directly online, end up calling them or getting them on the phone, most often than not taping it so that we can, as we say, show our work. You don't have to take our word for it. We'll show you exactly what we did. And then reporting that and making sure that there's public awareness around it and that either law enforcement and or public officials, public policy officials understand it.
You know, I'm glad you shared that story because, I mean, you talk about a 15-year-old boy saying, hey, I've got my dad's credit card. I'm ready to purchase these drugs. And the next question is, okay, go ahead with the credit card number. And for those parents that are out there listening to this, you know, that we're gonna ultimately talk more about the anabolic steroids and the growth hormone here later in this discussion. But just to understand the ease of purchasing any type of illicit substance on the internet, that most of these people do not care about the health of your loved one. They do not care about the age of the person that's purchasing these drugs. All it ends up being is, please give me your credit card number. I'm going to take your money and I'm going to send you the drugs, and we got some ramifications later. We'll deal with it. Is that fairly accurate to state?
It's completely accurate, and it's not altogether different than the old image of a street corner, someone peddling drugs on a street corner. The internet, and sadly, some of our most well-known platforms are the new street corner for the sale of drugs, whether it's opioids or steroids.
That's so sad. Now, Tom, let's shift gears for a minute, because what I'd like to try and give the listeners an idea of is, when did you first come in contact with the Taylor Hooton Foundation? How were you originally introduced to our organization?
That's a great question. We were doing investigations of platforms because we had done work, as I mentioned, on opioids. We were actually started by doing work looking at the ease by which you could buy painkillers. This was around 2013. And as we did it and found those on places we didn't expect to find them, like YouTube, we realized there's a lot more on YouTube. So we found, escorts, we found credit cards, we found fake passports, fake driver's license, and we found steroids. And as we did that, we realized, one, this scope of this challenge is much larger than we realized. And two, we began to engage with people who cared about those things, whether it was fake credit card, stolen credit cards or steroids. And, the Taylor Hooton Foundation is obviously the preeminent group when it comes to trying to raise awareness about performance and appearance enhancing drugs. And it was a no-brainer for us to reach out to the Taylor Hooton Foundation and say, we're seeing some things that are troubling, and if you want to work with us on it, we'd really love to do that.
And I don't remember, Tom, I believe it was October of 2013, if I remember correctly, when the investigative report was released that YouTube was advertising sites to buy illegal anabolic steroids. And what we can also do is be sure to place a link to not only the Digital Citizens Alliance, but also the report that was done. And I believe there's a film that goes along with it, to the 2013 report, where you guys had actually made a purchase on YouTube and everything is filmed. Is that correct to say?
Yes, absolutely. Like we do normally, we show our work. So we went on and found those offering steroids. We made purchases for both steroids and HGH, and we then had them tested at a lab. The steroids came back as real. The HGH, human growth hormone, came back as fake. And that was not a surprise to us, because we paid roughly $200 for each of those. And we're told in advance that if you're paying anything less than $1,500 to $2,000 for HGH, because it's very expensive, that it's almost certainly to be fake. And if you think about that from just whether you're not a 18-year-old young man who wants to play college football, or you're a 42-year-old woman who's trying to make sure that she stays in the best shape she can, the ease of that, of one, you're being able to purchase those online, and then two, the chance that you're getting something that is not what you're buying. And the challenge there is we don't know what you're buying at that point. There's a lot of different reports of things being in there like lead and everything else. But if you think about it, they're just playing Russian roulette with an online drug dealer who doesn't care anything about them.
You're right. And that's scary. It's really scary. In fact, I believe it was leading up to our 2019 gala, and that's 6 years ago. And
yes,
Eric Feinberg with the Global Intellectual Property Enforcement Center, we call it GIPEC, who we actually interviewed in episode 4, brought to our attention here at the Taylor Hooton Foundation that there was an ad for illegal anabolic steroids on Facebook that was placed directly next to a paid ad that we were actually running for our upcoming gala, which is our largest fundraiser. So to us, it was quite shocking. And when we would share this information with people, it was quite shocking, which ultimately led to a discussion about releasing a report about how companies like Google, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and others allow the sale of illegal drugs on these platforms. And I believe that's when we engaged, and you and your team got to work on researching this topic. And in September of 2019, and we'll also post this in the show notes as well, but the Digital Citizens Alliance releases a report titled Digital Platforms on Steroids, How Facebook and Google Enable the Sale of Illegal Appearance and Performance-Enhancing Drugs. So, Tom, what has changed since October of 2013 and over the 6 years leading up to this next report?
Sure. Some things have changed a lot and some things have not changed at all. But going back to the ad, to the promotion for illegal steroids and HGH next to a Taylor Hooton Gala ad is bizarre, but in the platform world starts to make sense. And that's the problem, because the algorithm tries to place ads and videos of similar topics next to each other. And this is a real concerning thing, and it's why every consumer should ask Google and Facebook to spend more time and not treat this as a PR problem, but treat it as an internet safety problem, because their algorithm will know a topic of something and they'll place it together. You had it where you had steroids being promoted next to a gala designed to raise money to try to raise awareness about the dangers of steroids. It's bizarre and perverse, but that's the way Google and Facebook think. I'll give you another example. When we were doing work looking at the sale of fake or stolen passports, the ad that Google ran next to it said, "Need an immigration lawyer." So they knew what the ad said. It was about passports, and they placed an ad next to it about immigration lawyers. So our challenge back to Google and Facebook and everyone else has always been, if you know enough to place an ad next to it and make money off it, by the way, then you should know enough to be able to identify those videos or posts that are offering illicit activities and at least flag them to be viewed by a real person to evaluate whether or not they should be on your platform. So it definitely is an issue where that's the business model, which is how do you get as many eyeballs on a platform, and how do you make money by monetizing it? And that's a serious issue. Now, in terms of what's changed and not changed, the street corner, the digital street corner has changed a little bit. As you see digital platforms reacting to pressure, you'll have people pushed off one street corner and go to another. For example, YouTube found less steroids initially after our 2013 report. They did a crackdown to get rid of the pressure, but then that just started to go to Instagram and other places. So they kind of moves around based on where the pressure is, just like, if this week the cops cracked down on 3rd and I Street, next week the drug dealers will move to a different street. The same thing happens online.
And how is this allowed? How are these illegal drugs being sold on the internet? Isn't that against the law?
There is a law that went in place at the early stages of the internet, which was designed to make sure that people that became platforms, and no one anticipated Google, like YouTube and Facebook at that time, it was in the mid-90s, that would make sure that they weren't liable for anything that appeared on their platform that someone else posted. And the reasons for it had a certain amount of sense at the time, any more than you wouldn't blame someone if a criminal used a phone, right? Because it's a platform. The challenge with this has become that as the platforms have changed, what is called Section 230, which is the provision in the law, has become such a blanket provision that in a way it's warped the purpose of it. And we're starting to see some reevaluation of that. For example, last year, Congress passed a law to make sure that Section 230, which was the provision that protected platforms, couldn't be used in such a blanket way for sex trafficking. So we're starting to see a reevaluation as the internet changes, and we go into that second and third era of the internet technology to make sure that that doesn't happen. So right now, the platforms view themselves as immune from any of the drug dealing or credit card sales or practically anything else that's nefarious, illegal, or bad actors that appears on their platforms. And very frankly, they view it as the kind of the camel's nose under the tent. They don't want to take responsibility for anything because they think, well, the moment they give an inch, they'll have to take responsibility for other things. So this is a real big game of tug of war that frankly, as a society, we need to resolve. And if you'll notice, you now have every state attorney general and the Department of Justice looking into Google and Facebook to try to understand their impact, whether there's antitrust issues, whether there's consumer safety issues. And so we're seeing now an evaluation of how these platforms should be a part of our lives when it relates to things like steroids or opioids or sex trafficking or stolen credit cards or, fake passports. There's a reevaluation going on.
And I know it's easier said than done, but I hope that's something they can bridge the gap on pretty quick, because it is a dangerous place out there for young people. And, that kind of leads me to my next topic of discussion is, again, in this report from 2019, and I remember visiting with you about this one-on-one and just find it fascinating, you and Dan and also Adam, and some of the work that you guys were doing. But you guys purchased anabolic steroids and human growth hormone from Facebook. Can you talk about, not going into too much detail, but just the ease of the purchase and sort of what that transaction ultimately looked like when you purchased these drugs on Facebook?
Yes, absolutely. And the team, as you mentioned, Adam Benson and Dan Palumbo, they do a fantastic job on this. In this case, and obviously we worked in collaboration with Eric Feinberg, who has just been a bulldog in trying to understand these issues, not just when it comes to steroids, but when it comes to terrorists and jihadists trying to use platforms as a place to recruit. So he's done amazing work on this. So when it came to the steroids issue, we began to look at sites that were offering it, and Eric was indispensable on this. And so we found sites, and in this one case, we found this one gentleman who was offering both HGH and steroids. This is a good example of it. And I did outreach to him. So I emailed him, said I was interested, wanted to understand it, kept the conversation very broad at first to understand all the things they had to offer. And what it came down to was ultimately I was purchasing anabolic steroids and HGH from him. And I made a purchase via Venmo. So Venmo is, for many of those who know, particularly if you have kids like I do, it's a very popular sharing system for paying people back on and kind of money transfer. So I paid them via Venmo and received the drugs a few weeks later. The interesting thing is, and this is one of the differences between, you asked earlier about 2013 and 2019. In 2013, our drugs came from Romania and China, the HGH and steroids. In this case, they came from New York and Florida. So there's now a lot more of a domestic distribution of illegal steroids and HGH as opposed to where it was, say, 6 years ago, where it was coming from overseas. So we received the drugs from Florida and Illinois and had them tested. And if you're willing to do it, it's not that difficult. You go online, you do some searches, and you find someone who's promoting the sale of these drugs, and you make a payment, and you're more than likely going to get something back. Whether it's real or not is the Russian roulette game. You have to decide whether you want to play.
What type of box does this show up in? Does it just show up in your mailbox and in a cardboard box, or can you describe what it looks like when it arrives at your home or your office?
Yeah, I mean, if any of the listeners have ever gotten like a UPS package, just imagine that. It's no different than that. It doesn't look. There's nothing discreet about it. I mean, it doesn't say HGH on the top of it, right? But it's just a regular like UPS package or other delivery system that's out there. And they get, they are so confident in what they're doing that they don't even try to hide it.
That just blows my mind. And I think the craziest part, Tom, is, and people can read this report for themselves, but when you share the lab results that you've sent off for the anabolic steroids and the human growth hormone, and the growth hormone comes back that it's not even human growth hormone, which again isn't surprising that you spent $200 on it. But what is it that people are putting into their bodies? And that's what they need to be asking themselves. And that's what I think is, especially as adult influencers and leaders in this space, we need to start questioning people. And we need to start questioning these companies is, what are you allowing the sale of to end up in the human bodies of one of my loved ones or somebody that's ultimately in my care?
Yeah, and there's a bit of an irony. If you think about it, as a society, we've become much bigger at label reading. You see these numbers, even at fast food or restaurants, that show the calories or what's in it. People read labels much more often. And yet, when it comes to things like this, we have no idea what's going into our bodies. And particularly if you're a young person who goes onto a platform that's associated with being mainstream. Google and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, they're all very mainstream. So when a criminal can go on, a bad actor can go on one of these sites and essentially peddle their wares, I believe it gives them a sense of respectability because they're on a mainstream site. This isn't the dark web. For viewers, the dark web is much more illicit place that you more or less need an invitation to get on. There's a lot of remarkably sick and dangerous things that are on it. These are mainstream places, platforms that are essentially operating almost as an adjunct to the dark web, where they're selling things that a consumer cannot say with confidence they know what they're putting in their body. So we know that steroids were real. We don't know what the HGH is, because if you think about it, what a lab does is it tests to see if what it says is in there is in there. It comes back and says what it says is in there is in there or isn't. But it can't test the 5,000 or 20,000 other things that it potentially could be, because it's just too large and onerous and a problem. So we actually don't know what's in there, simply
That's
because the possibilities are endless.
Yeah, and that's scary. And, Tom, the general public believes that this issue of appearance and performance enhancing substances, which include these anabolic steroids and human growth hormone, are just going on in sports. But in reality, what you guys found out was there's a large group of people out there that have no desire to compete, but what they're looking for is to improve their physique, and they want to feel better about themselves. Can you elaborate on just a little bit more about the survey that you guys did to the general public as to why they want to purchase these types of drugs?
Absolutely. But I first have to give full credit to the Taylor Hooton Foundation, because you're the one who really helped us understand that this was not just a 15-year-old football player or an 18-year-old gymnast, that this issue was much more pervasive. This is something the Taylor Hooton Foundation has been signaling and flagging for years, that this is not just a sports issue and not just an issue for people in their teens and 20s. So you're the ones who helped us understand that. And as we understood that better when we did polling, and we polled a very large subsection of the American public, we began to understand, and what came back to us was demonstrating that you were as likely to be a 40-year-old woman trying to stay fit as you were to be a 16-year-old boy trying to make your baseball team. That those who were taking HGH or steroids now work entirely across the spectrum of age and gender. And that is something that in many ways compounds the challenge that groups like you and groups like us face, which is if it's just teens and sports people, you can kind of tackle that in a subsection. But when it's a much larger demographic in society, it means our efforts to educate people and let them know what's happening are even more challenging. It means we have to really double down on our efforts.
You're right. And we find that that's the hardest part for us, is letting adult influencers, those who are in charge of our children today, whether that's in schools or out in the community, they believe that this is only going on in sports. And this might only be happening on the football team or the baseball team or the basketball team. And it's typically your males, right? And we know that's not the case. And that's something we are going to continue to push on. And we appreciate all of the information that you've helped provide, because it's so valuable to be able to show people why these people are purchasing these drugs. And it goes back to, something you said earlier about don't tell me, show me. And having some of this information in this report, we are now using it in our All Me Assembly programs that we're doing nationwide to show adult influencers is you don't have to go look at the sports teams for this to be going on. This is happening in the general population of your schools. And your kids are doing it, again, not for the desire to compete, but they want to look better and they want to feel better about themselves. But Tom, how much money do you think is being made by these tech companies that are allowing the sale of these illegal drugs on their sites? Do we know?
There was a estimate by a Harvard professor going back several years, back to our first report, that estimated that Google probably made about $1 billion profit a year from the sale of illicit goods and services on its platform. Google is now probably 4 or 5 times larger than it was back then. So if you look at that, it's a sizable amount of money because at the end of the day, these platforms' business model is attract as many people as possible to their sites so they get traffic, have them stay as long as they can, scrape their information, and then monetize it, either in ads or, for those who remember the Cambridge Analytica political scandal with Facebook, that was essentially selling to a company the personal information on about 70 million Americans. I think it might have been a bit higher. So when we go on those sites, they're collecting our information and then they're essentially turning around and monetizing it. That is the challenge we face. But just going back to one point when we were talking about steroids, the consequences of this. So think about these platforms and Instagram and what it's done from a cultural standpoint about creating an illusion of beauty or illusion of popularity. Think of Kim Kardashian or anyone else. I'm not picking on Kim Kardashian because people like her. That's great. But what we've done is we created an illusion of this is the way you're supposed to look. And a lot of these people are professional in trying to look that way. But yet we have, whether it's teen boys and girls up till people in their 40s and 50s, looking at that and being influenced by that on social media. And one of the places they're now going to get to try to deal with that is the same place that is essentially perpetuating that myth. So if Instagram says you have to look this way, how am I going to look this way? I'm going to get steroids or HGH. Where am I going to get them? Well, they're being advertised on Instagram. So it's a very weird, vicious circle. And it's one we have to come to grips with, because whether you're a 15-year-old boy trying to make your football team or a 45-year-old guy trying to look better, the consequences are the same. What our research found is that you were much more likely to have reported problems if you use steroids, meaning physical issues, than if you didn't. And that's true whether or not that affects all ages and all genders. And that's a problem.
And the need for awareness and education continues to be greater and greater and greater. But do you see these online companies changing due to the report and the information that you guys have uncovered and the work that we've done together?
I think more often than not, they tend to treat these issues as PR problems as opposed to internet safety issues. And I think that is a significant challenge. When we first started doing our work in 2012, 2013, when we would find these things, stolen credit cards, passports, drugs, we would say, hey guys, you got to do a better job. And for years we said that. We tried to cajole them. You might even say shame them when we had to. Just, hey, do a better job. And then when it wasn't happening, we kind of sent out a warning that said, if you don't do a better job, someone's going to step in and do it for you, meaning it's going to be regulated. And now we've reached a point with the awareness of this, really after, in part, the 2016 election and the feeling that there was manipulation, and it put a lot of focus on everything going on the platforms, where you now have essentially regulators, the FTC, Department of Justice, state AGs, and, law enforcement regulators, and then Congress, all now taking a hard look at these platforms because they feel they're out of sync with what society needs. So I think the work we've done has helped educate people to that effect. I think it's, sand on a mountain, and but at this point, the mountain's kind of been built, and all of these entities are now deciding what they think digital platforms should look like in the future. And very clearly, it didn't have to come to this. We need these digital platforms because this is part of our fabric as a society, and they're not going to go away, but we need them to act responsibly. We need them to take a better care in understanding what consumers want and need, and more importantly, how to keep them safe. And until we get that, I think they're going to face a lot of hard pressure from, not just groups like us who try to raise awareness, but from actual public entities who are now putting pressure on them to say, we want to understand your business model, and we want to understand how we got here. And it could end up being where they take action against them.
Yeah. So, Tom, I mean, where do we go from here? How do people who are listening right now help in this fight? What can they do?
Well, there's several things they can do. First off, don't assume that the people you know aren't using things that they get online in a dangerous way, because everyone always thinks it's someone else. I remember one of the first things your father said was he'd go to a coach, for a team, and the coach would say, "Yeah, I know this is a big problem. Fortunately, none of my players do it." And that wasn't true. Statistically, it probably was likely they were. But everyone believes that it can't happen to me, or it can happen to the people I know and love, or I'm in charge of as a coach, or people who are older. So the first thing is, don't assume that, and make sure that if you see something, you step in, because it's a dangerous road, whether it's steroids or opioids or whatever else it is. So when it comes to drugs. 2, you can let your public officials know this is an important issue to you. So whether that's at a town hall or writing, sending a comment to the FTC, to your member of Congress, let them know this is something that matters to you, and that this should be something that we should be taken seriously, because we are deciding right now what our society is going to look like in the future.
That's some very valuable information, and we appreciate you sharing that, Tom. And I wanted to just recognize you for a minute, because each year here at the Taylor Hooton Foundation, we present our annual Legacy Award to recognize and honor individuals who have made a significant contribution to the fight against appearance and performance-enhancing substance use. And in 2019, you were selected to receive the Legacy Award, which is custom created by Tiffany & Company at our All-Star Gala. What did winning this award mean to you?
One, I'm honored to be a recipient of it, and it is proudly displayed in my house. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I am a leader of a group, but the group is the leads. So to me, it was a nice honor on behalf of the whole organization. And I'm not just trying to be humble, because, Dan Palumbo and Adam Benson and all the folks we work with, including collaborate with, like, Eric Feinberg, are all instrumental to this. And in some instances, the coach gets more credit than the team for what the team did. And that is absolutely the case here. So for me, we really appreciated the honor and the recognition. It really, to us, spoke to the relationship we have with the Taylor Hooton Foundation as having these shared interests and working collaboratively together. So we really appreciate that. But I think I said in my remarks that the team does so much of the work here that, to me, it's a recognition for the team, and should always be that.
I'll just never forget standing in the front of the room when you were delivering those remarks, and you had Dan and Adam there with you, and it was great to finally meet them in person. We'd exchanged a bunch of emails and had talked on the phone multiple times. But when you were making those remarks, and we had some slides that went along with it to give a visual of, for example, one of the ads that was displayed on Facebook next to our Taylor Hooton Foundation gala ad. I'll never forget the look and the 200 plus people that were sitting in front of you, many with their mouths open, that you could hear a pin drop in that room, that had no idea at that time the ease of access of purchasing illicit substances on the internet. And one, couldn't thank you enough for sharing that information with us. But also, again, we want to congratulate you on winning this prestigious award, and all those that work for you to help keep us safe. And we also want to thank Tiffany & Company for donating that beautiful award. I'm sure they'll be very excited to hear that you're displaying it proudly in your home. But Tom, thank you again, and your team for everything that you're doing to keep us here safe on the internet.
Well, it's we look at the era we're in as a bit of a sifting out period. This is new for all of us. So as I say, and I'll always say it, we're deciding now what our society is going to look like. We wouldn't have had the capability to do the work we've done on steroids without the guidance and mentorship, frankly, of everyone at the Taylor Hooton Foundation. So you, your father, and everyone else there. So you're the ones who have educated us to understand it, and we really appreciate that. And it is a true partnership, and we really appreciate that type of partnership. It's been a great partnership for us, and we hope it is for, a very long time to come.
Yeah, we really appreciate working with you guys. But Tom, before I let you go, before we wrap this podcast up, I've got what we like to call our curveball questions. Okay, so these are a lot of fun. So they're going to be, just shoot from the hip here. So what is one thing people may not know about you?
One, I'm a huge Met fan. That maybe people know about me because I talk about it a lot. But the people I work with would know that I take everyone who knows Jenga, the game where you kind of remove pieces until it falls down. I actually do the opposite. I start from scratch and see how large a structure I could build before it falls down. So people in the office would see me in the back building this like 8 or 9 foot structure. And so that's something that only a very few people would know about me. And my coworkers would shake their head in dismay that I'm doing it again.
I love that though. And do you have a nickname? Something people call you? What do your buddies call you? Do you have anything?
I was Tommy growing up until I stopped answering to it.
Okay. And just Tom now or Mr. Galvin, huh?
No, Mr. Galvin was my father. Everyone better call me Tom.
Okay, Tom then. So here's an interesting one, and I think you might like this. If Hollywood made a movie about your life, who would be the best actor to play your role?
It's a great question. My wife, who I knew in high school and I got reunited with late in life, said that I always reminded her of John Cusack.
Okay.
So while I would like it to be Brad Pitt or Ryan Gosling or someone like that, I'll have to go with the person who my wife said reminded me of. So I'll go with John Cusack.
One of the things we're going to have to do, Tom, is I will post a picture of you in the show notes so that people can see that resemblance of you and John Cusack, because I can actually see that now that you say it. But that's great. But wanted to thank you again, Tom, for all you are doing, Digital Citizens Alliance is doing, all of your staff to keep us safe when our loved ones and, frankly, ourselves are out on these various social platforms and out on the internet just doing our day-to-day business and trying to get news and staying plugged in with our friends and family. But want to also thank you for the time that you've spent with us today on the All Me podcast and sharing the wealth of information that you have.
No, I really appreciate it. And, we all have loved ones. Many of us have kids. I have 5. I want to make sure they grow up safe. And so I think we have a responsibility to decide what internet safety will look like and our society will look like moving forward. And each of us in our own way can play a role with that. And this podcast is part of that. So thank you for having this podcast and thank you for inviting me on. I had a blast.
You bet, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooton Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.